Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. The state of our economy, courtesy of lockdown and the rest of our government's destructive policies, might reasonably drive a person to drink. More seriously, when it comes to making the most of earnings and savings in these increasingly challenging times, what's to be done for the best? More than a third no longer trust savings accounts. Volatile cryptocurrencies are in and out of favour, and a quarter of investors feel they can no longer rely on stocks and shares. In fact, more and more Brits are abandoning traditional investments and turning instead to the potential of vintage whisky. My next guests, Sam Brooks and Mike Webb from Vintage Acquisitions, join me now to explain why the water of life, Ushkaba, is attracting more and more interest. Mike, why whisky? What's the point? What's the value?
Well, it really makes common sense. We're in a world now where inflation's 9.1%, interest rates are on the up, and the last time this happened was sort of in the 80s when we had hyperinflation. And at that time, it was just the super rich that had access to commodities like oil, gold, fine art, antiques, cars, and that's really inaccessible for ordinary Joe public. And what we've done over the last sort of 12 years is put time and money into whisky, and it's a very simple proposition. It's not linked to indices. It's not attached to markets. Quite simply, the older it is, the more valuable it is. So the earlier you buy it, the better.
Doesn't whisky stay the same age that it goes into the barrel or into the bottle?
Correct, yeah, that's absolutely correct. So what happens is whisky only matures whilst it's in the wood, whilst it's in the cask. Once it's bottled, it stays that same age. Okay. Yeah, exactly.
So are people, in this instance, investing in barrels, not bottles?
Correct, yeah.
And what kind of money are we talking about here? You know, how big is the market now in people investing this way?
The market's huge, absolutely huge. So we're in our 11th year of trading, and we're bringing on more and more people now because we're making it accessible to everybody on the street. It only used to be accessible to people who had friends or family at distilleries or worked there themselves. But now we're able to access casks from the majority of distilleries, either directly or indirectly. People can invest from as little as around about sort of £2,500 up to sky's the limit.
You said it was a simple proposition, Mike. I take it that wherever the barrel is, the barrel stays.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our job, if you like, is to act as a client's duty representative. Mm-hmm. So we have all the relevant HMRC licences that allow us to do that. So effectively, and a lot of our clients are new to cask whisky purchase. They're just fed up with what's happening with their savings. They want to try something different. We also have a lot of parents and grandparents that buy for their children and grandchildren, because clearly it's a long-term strategy. So effectively, we've tried to make the process as simple as possible. So Sam will talk more about the care of the cask, because he's the real whisky man, but essentially, you buy a cask, it's stored under bond at a HMRC licensed facility in Scotland. We get it checked regularly to make sure the ABV and the amount of alcohol is as it should be. And it's got a couple of major advantages. With my IFA background, the main advantage is there's no capital gains tax payable on the profit.
So when you come to sell,
yes,
you're not taxed on the value, right?
Correct.
So, talk me through that. Mike was saying that you're the whisky man.
Yeah.
So, what is the system and what is the attraction?
So, the attraction is that people want something a little bit more exciting these days. They want to have a bit of fun. They don't just want a share certificate that could be worthless in a few years' time. They're purchasing something that's living and breathing. You know, whisky by its pure nature can't help but improve the longer it's held in the cask. OK, it's as simple as that. But the longer it's held in the cask, the rarer it becomes. So it's a simple investment methodology and it just pushes the price up.
How valuable can whisky be?
So just last week, there was an auction for an Ardbeg 1975 cask of single malt whisky that sold for £16 million. to a...
One cask?
One cask.
How many bottles of whisky is that?
So it would have made 440 bottles, I believe, and if it, without all the added costs on top, with, you know, dry goods and VAT and all the rest of it, it would have been about £36,000 a bottle.
When was that a single owner that held
Yes.
that cask?
Yeah, it was an anonymous female collector from Asia.
And how long had it been in that owner's hand? You know, how long had it taken for her investment to mature to that kind of level?
Well, it was a 1975 cask. It had been re-racked a couple of times, so basically it started its life, I think, in ex-bourbon, and then it got re-racked, so it got decanted into a sherry cask. And then, yeah, it had been at the distillery all that time. It was actually the distillery who sold it. It wasn't another individual. It was Ardbeg on Isla that sold it. So, and an interesting fact is that in 1997, Glenmorangie bought Ardbeg Distillery and all of its contents for half that amount.
So for 8 million, the whole thing,
Correct.
now a single cask is
Correct.
16 million.
Correct. Yeah.
Is this we're talking here specifically about vintage whisky, but I can only imagine that, say, vintage wine, you know, and other beverages and spirits are all being traded in this way. Would that be the case?
Yeah, people want something tangible. They want something that, you know, that they can touch, they can see, they can feel. With whisky, you can draw samples from the cask. Every year you can go and visit the cask, should you so wish. We've also got some other companies. We bottle our own whisky. We've got an events company called the Vintage Whisky Club. So we do distillery tour weekends, we do sporting events with all like-minded people that either like whisky or like investing into it. And they all get together and meet up, and it's a bit of fun.
Is the volatility that, say, in cryptocurrency, you know, people get very excited around things like Bitcoin and Ethereum and whatever, which seem to rise and fall, rise and fall.
Yeah.
Is it less terrifying to be invested in something like a vintage whisky cask?
Yeah, I think the fact that it's not linked to markets makes it attractive. We don't see the fluctuations with whisky. We know a very important statistic is when a whisky hits its 10th birthday, by that time 90% of that whisky has either been bottled or consumed, so that immediately gives it a desirability factor. And it's really a case of sticking with it and being in it for the long term. And that's why we've set up an online portal so clients can set up a username and password and view their cask sort of inventory and what they've purchased. And that also triggers the regauges, the cask MOTs every 3 to 5 years. And we use it interactively for the sporting events. We were at Lord's on Thursday, for example, with some clients. And also news, you know, if a particular client is after a particular cask and we get them into stock, then we can ping them non-invasively and they can respond.
Who makes the decision? I mean, I'm presuming that the casks sit and then eventually the distillery reaches a point where it wants to bottle that, it wants to fill bottles of whisky from that cask. What happens if the owner of the cask would rather it continued to mature and become older? You know, who has the final say on the destiny of the contents of the cask?
Good question. So all of our clients purchase their own cask. Okay, so it's their property. They can do with it as they please.
They always own the whole content. You don't buy half a cask.
No. It's always the whole cask or a number of casks. And then it's up to them what they do with it. They're the legal owner.
Right.
So they could bottle it if they want to. They could sell it. They could auction the cask. There's lots of different flexible options.
So I suppose potentially the distiller who's holding the cask it might be in their interests to acquire that cask if it's got to the point where it could be tens of thousands of pounds worth per bottle.
You're absolutely right. Depending on how rare the cask is at point of sale, there's sometimes an option to sell it back to the distillery where it was produced.
What is the most? What's the Rolls Royce at the moment? What's the most desirable cask of whisky anywhere on the planet?
Well, it's difficult because, I mean, all the records were broken with a cask of Macallan that sold recently for £1 million. A guy purchased it for £5,000 30 years ago, forgot he had it, got contacted by Macallan to say, oh, we've got this cask, you know, what do you want to do with it? He put it on an auction and it sold for 1.1 million, I think, in the end, didn't it?
Yeah.
over 30 years. So we've always thought that Macallan really is sort of the highest priced whiskey out there. However, this Ardbeg has just blown that out of the water. Yeah. So we were all stunned. I mean, we all had to pick our jaws off the floor really when the news was announced. It's
a fascinating prospect, I have to say. I love when when I'm invited to contemplate something I hadn't thought about before, and the idea of owning a cask of whiskey that's just sitting somewhere in the dark, becoming potentially more and more valuable.
Well, this is it. We can't speed up, like you said, with the cryptocurrency. You know, we're not going to make you a billionaire overnight, like can happen in the cryptocurrency, but you also won't lose your money overnight.
Yeah.
It's a steady growth. We can't speed up the maturation process that happens inside the cask. So as long as you've got sort of a minimum term of sort of 5 years, we always look at, but the longer the better, then it could be ideal for you.
And holding on to something real. As you say, it's not flickering digits on a computer screen. You can go and visit your cask of Ardbeg or Macallan or whatever.
Yeah, and draw samples every year. You know, that's really interesting because you get to see the change in the colour, the characteristics of the whiskey right the way throughout its life cycle. Get to share it with your family at Christmas. Oh, this is my cask, you know, what do you think of it? It's great. Do you like a dram, Neil?
I do.
Yeah?
It's not been unknown.
Good man.
You haven't brought some, have you?
Well, you're in good company here.
Mike and Sam, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Really good. Really interesting
Nice
idea.
to meet you.
And bear with me. Just